Okay, so I am going to talk a little bit more about breeding efforts to deal with higher temperatures. I work with lima beans, and so these are two pictures of lima beans experiencing heat stress. This is a lima bean raceme. Lima beans will reflower on the same raceme over and over and over again. And this is sort of an extreme example from a plant that was grown in a hot chamber in the greenhouse, and it kept flowering and flowering and flowering and setting new flowers, but not setting any pods, so it kept on flowering, and it made these things that look like little palm trees on the raceme. And eventually it got a little cooler in the greenhouse, and a few pods set here. Then down here, this is a picture of some seeds from individual plants that were grown in a chamber with cool night temperatures and a chamber with hot night temperatures. You can see that there's a lack of yield on those 5 plants. So Gordon talked a little bit about the idea that we have some crops that we consider to be cool season crops, and maybe breeding for heat tolerance is kind of difficult in those crops. However, cabbage, we think of that as a cool season crop, but it's actually quite heat tolerant. You can grow cabbage in the summer. But things that are closely related, such as broccoli and cauliflower, we have many more heat problems with them. Something like peas, I don't know that we're going to get heat tolerant peas, probably not. And then lettuce, I have a couple slides about lettuce at the end. But then we think of warm season crops, things that we think of as being extremely heat tolerant, just naturally, things like watermelon. But I don't think Gordon mentioned it when he showed the slide of the performance under different leaf temperatures, but those were 2 watermelon varieties. So even in a crop that we consider to be heat tolerant, like watermelon, we do see differences between genotypes in their ability to deal with heat stress. And then a crop that we think of as being very heat tolerant, like cowpeas, they will set pods, make seeds, do their thing all summer long. They don't seem to care. There's actually, the cowpea germplasm includes varieties that are very heat sensitive, and the heat sensitive cowpeas have temperature requirements that are similar to lima bean. And the only reason we have mostly heat tolerant cowpea varieties available to us now is because of very aggressive breeding efforts for heat tolerance in the 80s. So this is a crop, we don't even think about this as being heat susceptible, but that's because of work the plant breeders did a while ago. So these are a few crops where we could probably make some improvements in heat tolerance that I'm going to talk a little bit about. Snap beans have similar issues to lima beans. We get no pod set or split sets under heat stress. Lima beans I already mentioned and Gordon talked about. Broccoli, we have physiological disorders that happen because of heat stress. And then tomato. So Gordon sort of mentioned this, but I wanted to talk a little bit about how heat and drought stress interact. So they often occur together, and one can exacerbate or make the other worse, but the physiological effects that they have are distinct. Drought stress, when the plant is responding to drought stress, the main thing that happens is it closes stomates to reduce water loss. And so the main physiological effect of that is that you have reduced photosynthesis because gas exchange isn't happening. You can't get carbon dioxide into the plant to do photosynthesis. With heat stress, the effects are on the actual cellular components. So the membranes are getting too fluid, or proteins are denaturing. So things are happening to the in the biochemistry of the plant that are messing things up. So how the synergism of these two stresses work is that, so you have a drought stress plant, closes stomates to reduce water loss, then you have decreased evapotranspiration, so the plant can't cool itself, so you end up with higher leaf temperatures, and then you get heat stress effects. When you have heat stress, then you have a higher rate of evapotranspiration. The plant is using more water. So if that water is not available, then you're going to have a higher chance of water deficit. You can solve the drought stress problem with irrigation, but you can only mitigate the heat stress problem with irrigation. So drought stress, we can fix that with irrigation, but we can't fix the heat stress just with irrigation. Or with any of the things that Gordon talked about. So this part is about what we can do to make these plants able to deal with the heat stress in a physiological way. So this is what happens when broccoli is under heat stress. You get these rough or bumpy heads, and this occurs when the temperatures are above 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and the stage that is susceptible is when the plant is transitioning from vegetative to reproductive. And so Dr. Bjorkman at Cornell has done a lot of work to figure out when the heat stress is occurring and how to screen plants for heat stress tolerance. These are pictures of the terminal of the broccoli plant as it's transitioning from vegetative, and then this is transitioning into reproductive, and this is later reproductive phases. So, and then these are electron microscope pictures of these same stages over here. So this is a vegetative, and then this is transitioning to reproductive. So these structures are really small, so that the head is 1 to 2 millimeters across when heat stress is going to create a problem. So these are the stages in the plant development when, if you apply heat stress, you can do a good job of screening the material to see if you have tolerant or heat susceptible varieties. So once they figured that out, then they could work, they could make their selection more efficient. So these are more pictures of, this is a broccoli that was not heat stressed. So this is a 2 millimeter head. The bead, the florets are even. This is one that was heat stressed, and you have a few big florets that sort of escaped heat stress, and then some other ones that are brown and small. And as the head continues to develop, you see that unevenness continue. Okay, so the Eastern Broccoli Project is a project that's funded by the Specialty Crop Research Initiative, and their goal is to increase broccoli production on the East Coast, and a big part of that is trying to find heat-tolerant varieties or develop heat-tolerant varieties that are adapted to our region. So in their first round of trials of existing varieties and varieties that seed companies had in the pipeline, these were varieties that were identified as heat-tolerant and adapted to East Coast production. And these are ones that are available to growers right now. There are additional varieties that are in company pipeline that hopefully will be available soon. So with tomatoes, Gordon mentioned ripening problems that can happen in tomato when root temperatures get too high. Tomatoes also don't set fruit when we have high temperatures. So when nighttime temperatures get above 70 degrees or you get daytime temperatures above 90, that can cause tomato plants to stop setting fruit. And the understanding of why that happens is that it is a pollen issue. So these are flowers from a heat-tolerant tomato cultivar, and this is a heat-susceptible one. They were both under heat stress, so you can see that the flowers for the heat-susceptible one are smaller and somewhat deformed. If you look at the anthers of the heat-tolerant one, they're nice and neat and straight and even, whereas we've got deformity happening in the ones that are heat-susceptible under heat stress. Down here, these are pictures of pollen grains from each of these genotypes. This sort of amber-colored one, this is under normal conditions, so we got pollen tubes growing out of pollen grains, that's good. Under heat stress, the tolerant variety, you still have pollen tubes growing out of pollen grains, but in the heat susceptible variety, there's not very many pollen tubes there. That pollen is not germinating. So what they think is happening with tomatoes is that there's a problem with sugar transfer in the plant, that the pollen grains are not accumulating carbohydrate under heat stress, and that results in less viable pollen, and also that there may be issues just within the flower and the developing fruit with the carbohydrate transport. So with tomatoes, they have made some progress in breeding for heat tolerance. These are some varieties that are out there right now and available that have heat tolerance. The problem with tomatoes is that tomatoes are complicated. There are a lot of quality issues. There are a lot of disease resistance issues that we're also trying to select for. So these are varieties that have the ability to set fruit under high temperatures, but they're not the greatest varieties ever in terms of maybe quality or yield or disease resistance. So the tomato breeders are going to be busy for a long time trying to make the perfect tomato, but hopefully they'll get some heat tolerance in there. So lima beans.
How do the tomatoes pollinate?
They are, so the pollen falls out of the tips of the anthers onto the stigma. You see that one sticking out. So they're mostly self-pollinated, but they can be cross-pollinated. So with lima beans, this is showing yields from the variety trial from the past 7 years, plotted against our average July minimum temperatures. So generally, the minimum temperature is the nighttime temperature. With lima beans, the ideal temperature for pod set is somewhere between 60 and 65 degrees. When we get temperatures above 70, we have problems. High 70s, which is kind of what we had this summer, a lot of nights, not good. So this is yield down here, and this is average nighttime temperatures for July, which is when this trial is flowering. And you can see that we have correlation there with higher yields with cooler average nighttime temperatures. So in order to try to figure out what is going on with lima beans and heat effects on yield, I made this flow chart to think of all the things that could be going wrong. And so we could have problems with flowering initiation. This is something that they saw in cowpea. Some cowpea genotypes do not produce flowers when it's hot. With common bean and cowpea, there's pollen production or release issue. But there could be something going on with the ovules too. So these are all hypotheses of things that could go wrong. Then once you have pollination, maybe you could have heat effects on the embryo development or on the seed growing and maturing. So of these things, I've been trying to figure out what are the heat susceptible phases of reproduction in lima bean. So pollen release or production seems to be one of those things that's affected in lima bean. These are the pollen counts from plants that were grown in the cool chamber in the greenhouse in blue, or the hot chamber in the greenhouse in orange. And these are different genotypes here. So some of them, there's a big difference in the amount of pollen produced depending on whether they were in the hot or the cool chamber. And some genotypes, there didn't seem to be a big difference depending on what conditions they were grown under. So this G27525 is a landrace from Haiti, and then Bush Florida butter is another where we see pretty good pollen production under hot conditions, and it is a variety from the southern US. In cowpea and common bean, they see some differences in pollen viability under heat stress. I used a staining technique, which is similar to what they've done with common bean. Pretty much all of the pollen that we saw when we were looking was stained and therefore theoretically viable. So I'm not sure that we have an issue with pollen viability in lima bean. It's more an issue of pollen production or release. One thing that I observed in these plants that were growing in the hot chamber was a lot of them had the stigma outside of the keel. So for lima beans, the reproductive structures are supposed to be inside of this coiled up thing here, but this one was under heat stress and we have anthers and the stigma sticking out, and that can interfere with pollination because sometimes the anthers are still in there. Those anthers look like they're not going to open up and release the pollen, so that could be interfering with pollination. And so I had 47% of the flowers in the hot chamber had the stigma outside of the keel versus 11% in the cool chamber. This is a picture of some of the things I see for heat stress lima bean flowers. There's not very much pollen that has been released and is hanging out there on the style, and really not very much on the stigma at all, versus one that was under cool conditions where we have lots of pollen and a whole pile of pollen sitting there on the stigmatic pad. And then what's going on with the anthers? Where is that pollen? Well, apparently it's still stuck in the anthers, and it's not being released under high temperature conditions. These are anthers. There's not very much pollen left in there under the cool conditions versus the hot conditions. And similar to what they see in tomato, we see some deformities that seem to happen more frequently in flowers under high temperature conditions, stigma and the anthers ending up outside the keel, or the keel being closed up and deformed and those reproductive parts sort of mixed up and jumbled up there in the middle. So pollen production and or release for lima bean seems to be a big issue. So I can try to screen my germplasm for pollen production under high temperatures. That might be a good idea in the breeding program. I wanted to know if there were differences in the number of pods that were being set between these heat tolerant versus heat susceptible genotypes, or in the number of seeds per pod. For many of the genotypes, there was not a big difference in the number of pods, but there were differences in the seeds per pod, so that suggests, again, that there's a pollination and or fertilization problem happening. And then this is overall yield of these plants under hot and cool conditions in terms of seed weight. So Bush Florida butter, G27525, we don't see as much yield reduction under heat stress. C Elite Select, which is one of our very commonly used green baby lima cultivars, there is a fairly substantial and significantly different yield under heat stress in this greenhouse trial. And Fort Hook 242, which is extremely heat susceptible, there was basically no yield under high temperature conditions. And these are pictures of the seed yield of Fort Hook 242, which is very heat susceptible, C Elite Select, which is somewhat susceptible, and Bush Florida butter, which is relatively resistant. And the differences in yield were due to the number of seeds, not to the per seed weight. So once the seed is set and the embryo is developing, the plant seems to be able to size that seed and mature it without difficulty under hot conditions, but it's getting the seed set. These are the different genotypes with yield plotted, yield here plotted against the number of pollen grains shed under heat stress. So with plants where we had higher number of pollen grains shed when they were heat stressed, we had higher yields, and there's a nice correlation there. And these are some pictures of the heat-susceptible varieties grown in cool conditions and hot conditions. Pods there, no pods there. I pulled all the leaves off so you can see the pods. They don't like, I guess I should mention that. And then these are some of the heat-tolerant genotypes. You can see that they were able to produce pods under high temperature conditions, similar but not quite as many as under the cool conditions. I did some screening this past summer in the greenhouse to try to identify additional germplasm that has heat tolerance, and these are some of the diverse lima bean genotypes that have heat tolerance in that screening. So these are things I will be using in the breeding program as sources of heat tolerance and trying to characterize the heat tolerance that these possess more fully. And yeah. Any questions?